After enjoying Eric Metaxas sharing about his spiritual journey on the internet, I read this comment. Thank God he's way smarter and more patient and extremely more efficient at communication than we are. I'm sure that's the sentiment of all who attended Canada's 48th National Prayer Breakfast in Ottawa last Tuesday. Some of us had to be patient and wait for these 3 wonderful visits, peeking into Eric's new book, 7 Men and the Secret of Their Greatness. And let me just say, we have touched on George Washington, William Wilberforce, Eric Liddell. If you haven't read the 600-plus page Bonhoeffer Book of the Year 2011, guess what? You can get the condensed version because he's the next man on our list, Eric.
Conveniently, right? I've had so many friends that really are illiterate. They say, I can't read 600 pages. Now, what they don't know, Moira, is that they could, because the story is so fascinating, it will suck you in. But to whet their appetite, I said, I've got to get the 20-page version out there, especially for young people who maybe don't have time, they got studies or whatever, but everyone needs to know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the greatest men of history. And you can hardly believe how great he was. He was a sinner and a flawed man, just like everyone except Jesus, but he's somebody that I want to point especially young men toward, to say, you can be like this. Learn from this guy, because look what he did. It's pretty hard to believe, and yet it's true.
And as tragic as his death seems, just a few weeks before the end of the war, killed by the Nazis, he's one of the most quoted Christians. Oh. And I want you to quote him from your book,
yeah, sure.
His sermon on death.
Yeah.
In 1933. Is it just down here?
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. This is, he writes, this is from 33, right? So this is 12 years before he dies. He gives a sermon. Imagine being in the congregation listening to this. He says, how do we know that dying is so dreadful? Who knows whether in our human fear and anguish we're only shivering and shuddering at the most glorious, heavenly, blessed event in the world. Death is hell and night and cold if it is not transformed by our faith, but that is just what is so marvelous, that we can transform death. Wow. I mean, and there's more. This is a man, he understood that, you know, we don't need a Savior because we're sick. We're dead. And God calls us to understand that we're dead. And if we're dead, he can raise us from the dead with the resurrected life of Jesus Christ. But if I just think I'm sick and I need a little help, God can't help us. Bonhoeffer famously says, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. This idea of dying to self, I mean, it's at the heart of this whole book. All the 7 men in this book die to self. That's the idea. Jesus, of course, the ultimate example. But these are 7 men from history. They die to self. It means something different in every person's life, what it is to die to self. In Bonhoeffer's case, it means literally dying at age 39. It means dying to self every day. But if you die to self every day, then you're filled with the resurrection power of Jesus every day. And then you know that death, where is thy sting? What is the, I'm not afraid of death. If you're not afraid of death, you're going to live differently. And that's the only way to live. God created us to live that way. So Bonhoeffer, to me, the ultimate example of that kind of a life.
And for Jackie Robinson, a baseball hero, that sacrifice was not retaliating.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's hard to believe that he had the strength to not fight back. Sounds crazy, right? But I mean, he was, in fact, he was kind of a hothead, very passionate. And as a young man, a minister, serious minister, and by the way, Jackie Robinson was a profound Christian, as was Branch Rickey. That story is in the book. It's not in the movie 42. Incredible to know that he was such a strong Christian. But it's because of that, well, I should say that this minister gets a hold of him and lets him know early on, before he's recruited to do this historic thing, that to not fight back, to obey Jesus, who says, turn the other cheek, that's the truly heroic thing, to be bigger than your enemy who, you know, calls you this or that. And then when his moment in history comes, here you have Branch Rickey, a profound Christian, saying, I want you. Why? Because you hit 330 and because you can steal bases? No, that's half of it. The other half is that you're a man of character. In order to do this heroic, historic thing, which is a seminal moment in civil rights history, you need to be a man of character who will know that you've got to turn the other cheek. Otherwise, we will fail. People are going to just say, oh, Jackie Robinson lost his head. You know, those hot-headed Negroes, right? That's what they were waiting to write this. If he retaliated, they were just waiting. He says, you've got to obey Jesus and turn the other cheek. Are you willing to do that? And in their seminal moment together, this moment, he opens up a book called The Life of Christ. That's not in the movie. It's in my book. And he says to Jackie Robinson, he reads to him from the Sermon on the Mount. And you think that Jackie Robinson, this is a hero. This is a man who was willing to be abused, to be treated this way. Why? Because he cared about the African-American boys and girls of the future. He did this for them. I mean, he did it for all of us, but he did it for them. That's called sacrifice. That's what God says, this makes a man great. And, you know, he was a truly great man.
Wonderful to read about him. Billy Graham calls this next man the greatest single Christian leader of the 20th century, Pope John Paul II.
Yeah, Karol Wojtyła, as he was known before he became Pope. I won't get into that story too much just for time, but I'll tell you, you want to talk about greatness, a man of prayer, profound prayer. And I forgot to say also that Jackie Robinson, he was on his knees every night. He said specifically, on my knees praying for strength to get through this. Now, Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, was known as a man of prayer. He prayed for hours. He stood against the Nazis in occupied Poland. He stood against the communists in Poland.
With so much wisdom.
Just incredible. That story needs to be known. And you talk about a man's man. This guy was a skier and an athlete and just tremendous human being. You know, we know of him at the end of his life, but yeah, he's the sixth man in Seven Men.
And I do have an image from your book of George Washington on his knees every morning.
Yeah,
praying.
People don't know that.
Yeah, amazing secrets unfold, and that's exactly what the title is, The Secret of Their Greatness. Now, with the last minutes, you saved your favorite personal hero for the last, and I just love the sweet irony of how a gushing letter of appreciation to Chuck Colson would be the beginning of this story.
It's unbelievable.
You are now the voice on
well,
Breakpoint.
There's a time when you have to acknowledge God's hand, and this, my being, you know, on Breakpoint now as a voice, along with my my friend John Stonestreet, who's spectacular. Watch that guy. To be able to do this, it's clearly God, because I wouldn't dream of saying that I could fill Chuck's shoes. I mean, truly, it's embarrassing even to talk about him in the same breath. I revered him when I first became a Christian 25 years ago. I immediately started reading Chuck's work. I finally knew I could meet him, so I wrote a letter to him, and when I did meet him, gave him this letter. He wrote me a letter back and said, oh, maybe someday our paths will cross or something, and I thought, well, oh, sure, you know. And a year later, I get contact from the office, would you like to maybe consider being a writer for Breakpoint? And I just thought, oh my goodness. And so I got to work for him, and you know, when you see somebody up close, and they're your boss, and you still think they're a hero, that says something.
It does.
That's a truly great man, and he was. And he was, I mean, most famous for the Watergate scandal, but how he repented, how he turned his life over to God, and I won't tell about the sacrifices now, but he made innumerable sacrifices. Really, the most important one, he refuses a plea bargain. Again, you want to talk about strength? Where do you get that strength from? From his faith. He says, I will not lie. I'll rather go to jail. And he went to jail. And then he gets out of jail, and he makes another sacrifice, because again, that's the theme of this book. That's the secret of greatness, sacrificing for others. He says, I get out of jail, now I can just go on and have a lucrative career as a big deal lawyer and put this behind me. No, he goes back into jail, spends the rest of his life, 35 years, going back into jails, ministering to prisoners, to the least of these, because he believes this is what Jesus called him to do. And that's why he's great. And when he was on his deathbed a year ago, I had the honor of introducing his last speech. I was there.
March 30th, 2012.
It was, I mean, it's just over a year ago. He was stricken in the midst of the speech. John Stonestreet and I leapt up, moved him into a chair. I mean, it was this thing, we were wondering, what is going on? And from that point on, it was over. He died, you know, not many weeks later. And when he was on his deathbed, I said, this man has to be the seventh man in Seven Men. And if anybody's curious, he bumped Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, by the way, Lincoln is ticked. Yeah, Lincoln's very upset. They're working it out. They're working it out. But I said, you know, I couldn't. There are no living men in this book. I said, I'm not going to, you know, do that. But when Chuck was on his deathbed, I said, there's just no doubt that he ought to be the seventh man. People need to know the true story, and I have the honor of having known him personally. Calling him a friend, and to actually know that he lived this. This is not just somebody from history. Then, you know, I can say, I mean, I would say this about all these people, but I can say I knew this man. he really was this man. And what a wonderful thing. And we need to teach, especially our young men, that God calls you to be this kind of a man. That's his plan for you.
Well, the reality is, all of these men have helped to shape the man you are today.
I hope so.
And I can't imagine that we will not be called to something higher as we read about their real life examples. And a couple of them had really sketchy starts. Even Washington.
That's kind of the point, right?
Who is the
Every one
greatest
of
in
us,
your
you
view?
know, it's not what you did in the past, it's what you do today and from here on in.
I really want to encourage you. My husband, by the way, says he's really looking forward to your next biography. Does that irritate you?
Absolutely.
He doesn't
but
want to
that's
write
okay.
biographies, but you're so good at it. This book is at our e-store. It is not just a great gift on time for fathers, but I really encourage you to have your children and your grandchildren read this, because we are in a world where heroes seem to be imploding. They are only in the comic strips or the movies about them. It's not true. We've had great world shapers, and I think Eric's chosen some of the finest. Thank you for what you do.
Thanks for having me on. It's
we
a
just
privilege.
love you.
It's a privilege to be here. It's an honor. Thank you.
Come on back, and I'm going to point you one more time to Eric's personal testimony in Christianity Today magazine this month, and at your website.
EricMetaxas.com.
I knew you needed to say
Now,
that
if
one
you
more
can
time.
spell it, and if you can't spell it, it's still EricMetaxas.com.
He'll come up. He's everywhere. Bless you.
Thank you.